Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we see Saul dying. He's injured by a Philistine and he ends up falling on his sword and dying. And this ends the struggle between David and Saul in our story. And so David is relieved of Saul's persecution, not by his own hand, but through the work of the Lord. And today's devotion is going to be more reflective as we consider this whole story of David and Saul. Because there's something that we can draw from this that will apply in our lives today and with the things that we struggle with even here in the 21st century. And as we think about the story of David and Saul, the first thing we might ask ourselves is why Saul? Why did God allow Saul to be king, given that he ended up so rotten and so contrary to God's desire? Why did God allow it? It's my belief that God all along desired for David to be the ruler of his people. And had God just waited a few more years, David would have grown up and been of age, and God could have appointed him instead of Saul. And it would have saved David a lot of trouble, not to mention the whole kingdom of Israel a lot of trouble. And so we might wonder, why Saul? Well, not to oversimplify it, but it is kind of simple. God gave him Saul because they asked for Saul in a sense. Remember, Saul's name actually means desired or asked for. And God gave them what they asked for. They got the king that they desired. He was a king that did look the part, like the other kings around them. They wanted a king like the nations around them, and Saul definitely looked the part. He stood head tall above everyone else. He was handsome in appearance. He looked like a king. So that's basically the simple answer. Saul was asked for. But we could also see another side of this as well. With Saul being appointed as king, and with David coming onto the scene, what develops here in the story is a type of the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. Excuse me, the flesh and the spirit. We see in the text that Saul is clearly a type of the flesh. He symbolizes the flesh. We can see this in the way that he acted, in the way that he responded to situations. He was very impulsive. He was not patient. He didn't wait on the Lord, didn't trust in the promises of God, but tried to take matters into his own hand. Saw that time and time again. We see him trying to establish his own kingdom, and that's what the flesh does, right? It wants its own kingdom. It wants to rule itself and not submit to the rule of God. In a lot of ways, Saul is a type of the flesh, whereas David is a type of the spirit. David was a man after God's own heart, as we read in 1 Samuel. And so David was a person who trusted in the Lord, who waited on the Lord. He didn't take matters in his own hand, although twice he could have killed Saul very easily. He waited, said, I'm not going to lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. The Lord will take vengeance. He trusted in the Lord. He showed faith. You see that, you think about that scene with Goliath. David definitely becomes for us a type of the Spirit. And this is very common. This is something that we see as a theme throughout the Scriptures, where the flesh always precedes the Spirit. Saul came before David, a type of the flesh, and then David came after Saul, a type of the spirit. Ishmael is a type of the flesh, back in the book of Genesis, and Isaac was a type of the spirit. We can look at Galatians chapter 4 and see that. Isaac was according to the promise, after the spirit. And then Esau, remember the story of Jacob and Esau? Esau was a type of the flesh. Esau often demonstrated the characteristics of the flesh. But then Jacob was a man of the Spirit. In other words, he was according to the promise. And you can refer to Romans chapter 9 in connection to that. And we could go further on through the Old Testament, but we could look more broader than that and see that the law of Moses, which was a commandment more connected to the flesh, as Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 16 could be alluded to, preceded the law of Christ, which was, of course, a law of the Spirit. You could refer to 2 Corinthians chapter 3 to get a pretty detailed description of the contrast between the law of Moses and the law of the Spirit. You could look at Romans chapter 8 and verse 2. It talks about the law of the Spirit of life. And so there you see the flesh preceding the Spirit. Also, even in our own personal lives, we have our physical birth when we come into this world, and then we have our spiritual birth that comes later. So you have the physical before the spiritual. If you think about the resurrection, we live in a physical body now, eventually to be resurrected into a spiritual body. And so the flesh always precedes the Spirit. And so this is just in line with the way the Scriptures deal with these types of the flesh and the Spirit. I noticed that the older typically represents the Jews, which were following God in a fleshly way, and the Gentiles typically represent the Spirit, or the younger brother represents the Gentiles who were receiving God by faith there in the first century. And whenever there is a type of the flesh and spirit in Scriptures, there's always a conflict. That's also another characteristic of this typology, this type of typology. With Ishmael and Isaac, if you remember, if you go back to Genesis 21 and verse 9, and then cross-reference Galatians 4 and verse 29, you have this conflict. Remember, Hagar would speak harshly against Sarah, but also Ishmael was making fun of Isaac. You have that obvious conflict between Jacob and Esau. Esau at one point wanted to kill Jacob because he had stole his blessing. Between the law of Moses and the law of Christ, there was conflict in the first century against the Jews who were holding fast to the Mosaic law, against those who were taking Christ by faith. Even within the church, as you read the book of Galatians, and it's even hinted at in the book of Romans, there was this conflict coming about between the two. And we see it with David and Saul. For decades, there's a struggle between David and Saul. Saul persecuting David. Saul persecuting David. At one point, Saul might say, okay, well, I'm done persecuting you, and then you go right back to doing it again. And this all cumulatively typifies the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 17 talks about this struggle between the flesh and the spirit pretty plainly. Galatians 5 and verse 17, where he says, "For the flesh sets its desire against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please." And we've experienced this in our lives, right? We've been born of God. We have this new heart, this new desire for God, and that's resident within us. But at the same time, we have these fleshly desires, these fleshly concerns that weigh against our hearts. And there's this struggle between the two. And it's very similar to the struggle between David and Saul. Both of them are struggling one against the other, trying to gain some ground. And so what this teaches us is that we need to end the struggle by walking according to the Spirit, and let the Spirit take the true rule in our lives. It's time for the flesh to be done away with. And just as with the story of David and Saul, the conflict wouldn't end until Saul actually died. The same thing is true with the conflict within us. The conflict will not resolve itself, and it will not end until the flesh is put to death. And this is done by placing our faith in such scriptures as Romans chapter 6, which talks about how our flesh has been dealt with through the cross. He says in verse 6, knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, that is with Christ, in order that our body of sin might be done away with. Our body of sin might be done away with. So that we would no longer be slaves of sin, for he has died, is freed from sin. And so the first part is negatively. We have to take away the flesh. We have to allow the flesh to die and to be done away with. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 24 it says, now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. We got to put the flesh to death. And really, in actuality, our flesh is already dead. We were crucified with Christ. But we got to take that by faith and live out that crucified life that was brought about in our baptism, as Romans chapter 6 speaks about. But then, positively, we have to begin to walk according to the Spirit. Because it's through walking in the Spirit that the deeds of the flesh are done away with. He says in verse 13 of Romans 8, for if you are living according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. And so we take by faith our crucifixion with Christ, but at the same time we walk by the Spirit, and in doing so we put to death the deeds of the body. And so Paul gave this solution to this struggle. Remember in Romans chapter 7, he talked about how the things he wanted to do, he wouldn't do. And the things he didn't want to do, he would do. And there was always this internal conflict within him. Well, the answer to that was to walk according to the Spirit. Because the mindset on the Spirit is life and peace. And that's what we all want, right? We want peace. We want the struggle to end. And so that's the way it has to happen. The flesh has to die. We have to take by faith our crucifixion with Christ. And at the same time, we have to walk by the Spirit. Allow the Spirit to be back on the throne again, to set our minds upon Him and to live by Him, and to let Him set up His kingdom within us. So these are just some things to think about. Hopefully they helped you out with your own spiritual life as you relate these things to yourself. I do thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.